Hi class, here's another hypothesis test example, this time two population proportions. Suppose we wanted to see if a higher percent of women voted than men. Say we sampled 80 men and found that 45 voted. We sampled 120 women and found that 70 voted. Can we infer that a higher percent of women voted than men? So step one, develop the hypotheses. Can we infer that a higher percent of women voted than men? So proportion of men was less than the proportion of women. I just used men and women in that order because that's how it was in the problem. Step two is assigning alpha, how willing we are to make a type 1 error, which is wrongly rejecting a true null hypothesis. So it doesn't say the default is 0.05. Now step three, do the sample results allow us to possibly infer HA? Well, proportion of the men is 45 over 80, which is 56%. Proportion of women is 70 over 120, which is 58%. So that is higher than the men, so we could possibly infer this. But sample results vary, so we have to see if it's if it's actually if we can infer that. So what's our predictable distribution? Step four. Well, our predictable distribution proportions are binomial, but that's approximated with the normal, so we'll use a z-distribution. So the steps 5 and 6 is calculate a p-value and state your conclusion. So let's grab our calculator and we turn it on and clear. We go to stats and we go to tests, and this time we go to 2 proportion z-test. So down here, 2 proportion z-test, enter. So let's see, we had 45 men and out of 80, and then we had 70 women out of 120 women, and we wanted to see if it was less than. So we'll go over here and then hit enter, and then come down, calculate, and we calculate. So let's see, our z-score is a negative, basically negative 0.3, not very small. I mean, not very large. It's a negative 0.3. Not a lot of evidence right there. And the p-value was 0.385. Okay, so 0.385. All right. And by the way, what's left here is P1 is the proportion of men, P2 is the proportion of women. This is a pooled proportion. And it just shows N1 and N2. Okay. All right, so here's our p-value. So now this sample result, right? If the proportion of women was in fact larger than the proportion of men, then or if they were equal, if the proportions were equal, then this sample result is not very unlikely at all. They're very close, and one would be greater than the other. So this is a pretty likely result if HO is true. So we wouldn't reject it. Now, how likely was it? About a 38% chance, even if the null was true, that we would get these sample results. Pretty likely. So we're not going to reject that. So since the p-value is greater than alpha, right, we do not reject HO, and there is not sufficient statistical evidence to infer what, right? Can we infer that a higher percent of women voted than men? We can't. So to infer, there is not sufficient statistical evidence to infer that a higher percent of women voted than men. I hope that's helpful.